Good morning, everyone. Welcome in. We are continuing our study of the book of Yehoshua. In our last class, we really did chapters 10 and 11, getting into the nitty-gritty of some of the conquests of the Jewish people. We did the famous story of Shemesh b'Giv'on Dom, the sun and the moon, standing in their place to give time for the Jewish people to complete their conquest of many of the Canaanite kings. We then went into chapter 11, which talked a lot about the destruction and conquest of the remaining southern kings. And also we talked about the northern kings, the battle against them as well. So we read through a lot of the text and the battles themselves and the conquests that happen. And really that part finishes off the first half of the book of Yehoshua. From chapters 1 to chapter 11, the first half of the book of Yehoshua talks all about the Jewish people entering the land, conquering the land, the miraculous battles, the evolution into more natural kind of victories, and how they treated and conquered and annihilated the different Canaanite kings. That's really the first half, and that's what we concluded in last week's class. This week, we start with chapter 12, and we transition into the second half of the book of Yehoshua, which is going to focus most of its attention on part 2, which is settling the land. So anytime you're going to take over the land, it's really a two-part process. You first have to drive out and conquer the current inhabitants, but even once that's done, there's still a whole second part. People assume, okay, we won the war, that's it, there's nothing left to do. The actual settling of the land of Eretz Yisrael is a process in and of itself. The people have to figure out, with the leadership of Yehoshua, A, which tribes are going to go where, how they're going to break down the land of Eretz Yisrael. B, even though they conquered many of the tribes of Canaan and they drove them out, there are still people living in those areas. They did not, as we will see in chapter 13, completely drive away everybody, even in the lands that they conquered. And we will see that there's many cities and many regions which they did not reach to be able to conquer. And that will become a talking point as we go further in the book of Yehoshua and into the book of Shoftim, where these little cities and these mini nations, I guess you can call them, still reside in the land of Israel and cause a lot of problems for the Jewish people. The Hav? Right. Well, no, she was from Jericho. We destroyed Jericho completely, and Rahav ended up joining forces with the Jews. Yeah, so she's with them. But we'll see, as I'll show you on the map in a moment, there are going to be a number of regions that the Jewish people didn't conquer, a number of little mini groups that they left around, and some cities that they didn't fully drive out. And even when they destroyed these cities and they pushed out the people, the Jewish people still had their home base in Gilgal, which was the first city that they had where the Mishkan was, and they had yet to really bring in their presence and settle into those lands, pushing out those other people. So it's a process. It definitely takes time. In fact, as we'll see, the rabbis tell us it took them double the amount of time to settle and divide the land of Israel from what it took them to actually conquer the land of Israel. We'll highlight how the rabbis got to this, but the rabbis tell us in Masechet Arachin, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, that it took them 7 years to conquer all of the tribes, all of the Canaanite nations. It took them 14 years to divide up the land, right? So it's not a simple process to go about settling the land. Or maybe it was 7 and 7, I forget. It might have been 7 and 7. But regardless, it took them just as much, if not more time, to be able to settle the land as it did to conquer. And it's important to highlight that because people just think once you conquer, you automatically settle, and it's not actually the case. It takes them time to do this. They have to draw out the boundaries. They have to know who's going to go where. They have to push out the remaining remnants of whoever's there, and so on and so forth. So that's point 1 that I just wanted to highlight over here. And that's where we're going to start off here in chapter 12. So if you have your link and you could pull up chapter 12, I'm reading here from the Pesukim. They're up on the screen here for those who are online. The book of Yehoshua always connects itself back to the Torah and to Moshe Rabbeinu's actions. And that's where we start over here. Chapter 12 opens the first handful of verses, 1 through 8, talking about how Moshe actually broke up. He was the first one to help settle the land of Israel because he broke up the portion that was on the other side of the Jordan River before the Jewish people got in to the 2.5 tribes of Reuven, Gad, and Menashe. Take a look at the Pesukim. We'll read them quickly. It says, "Ve'ele malchei haaretz asher hiku bnei Yisrael vayirshu et artzam." These are the kings of the land that the Jewish people destroyed, and they inherited their lands. Be'ever hayarden, on the Transjordan, mizreha hashamesh, on the eastern side. That's the side outside of the actual boundaries of the land of Israel. Minahal Arnon ad Har Hemon v'chol ha'arava mizraha, on the eastern side. Who were that? Sihon melech ha'emori, Sihon the Amorite king, who was in Heshbon. Moshel me'aro'er asher al sefat nahal anon v'toch ha'nahal v'hatzia Gil'ad v'ad yabok ha'nahal gevul b'nei Ammon. This is the tribe and border areas where Ammon was, and Sihon melech ha'emori had taken over. Verse 3 talks about more about the lands of Sihon. Verse 4 then takes us to the lands of Og melech Bashan. These were the two most powerful kings, which it's discussed in the Torah itself that Moshe conquered them on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Pesukim Dalid, Hey, talk about the boundaries of Og, and you could see here in Pasuk Vav, Moshe Eved Adonai Uvnei Israel Hikum. It was Moshe, the servant of God, and the Jewish people in his time who hit them and destroyed them. Vayitena Moshe Eved Adonai Yerusha. Moshe, the servant of God, gave it as an inheritance, Lerubeni velagadi, to the tribes of Reuven and Gad, ulahatzi shevet hamnashe, and to half of the tribe of Menashe. So you might say, why does the text have to repeat this to us? It's very redundant. We already know that Moshe Rabbeinu conquered those lands and already gave them out. But it's worth noting that when Yehoshua is about to come and divide up the land in the land of Israel, which he conquered, he does so in the same fashion as Moshe Rabbeinu did. And essentially what the text is telling us is that it's a continuation of what Moshe himself already had started. Not to think of these as two separate incidences, Moshe did one thing and Yehoshua did the other, but rather to link the two together and to say what Moshe Rabbeinu started on the eastern side of the Jordan, conquering and settling, is what his student Yehoshua now, the next link in the chain, is continuing to be able to do within the land of Israel of conquering and settling. And again, it's an emphasis on a theme that we've talked about throughout the book of Yehoshua, is Yehoshua being the continuation of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe is the sun, Yehoshua is the moon, as the rabbis say. And the moon reflects the light of the sun. Everything that Yehoshua does is with his great teacher Moshe Rabbeinu in mind. He does it to honor his legacy and to complete the mission which Moshe Rabbeinu himself, for other reasons, was unable to accomplish. Then in verse 7 and 8, it turns our attention to Yehoshua. Ve'ele malchei haaretz asher hika Yehoshua uvnei Yisrael. And these are the kings of the land which Yehoshua and the Jewish people destroyed. Be'ever hayarden yama, on the western side of the Jordan River, mi Ba'al Gad bebik'at Lebanon, from the Baal of Gad to the valley of Lebanon, ve'ad har hehalak ha'oleh se'ira, vayitena Yehoshua leshivtei Israel. Yehoshua gave it to the tribes of Israel, Yerusha kemahlekotam, as an inheritance according to how he will, in the next coming chapters, divide it up. He destroys the Canaanite nations, Bahar uba Shefela, in the hill country and the lowlands, uba Arava uba Ashedot, and in the Arava and in the slopes and in the wilderness and in the south. He hits the 6 nations. It only mentions 6 here because there were 6 major ones. There was a 7th more minor one. That's the Girgashi, which our rabbis tell us they fled. They just picked up and went because they did not want to fight the Jewish people. What are they? The Hivi, the Emori, the Kinaani, the Perizi, the Hivi, and the Yebusi. They are all the 7 Canaanite nations that Yehoshua destroys. Okay. So again, that linkage is clearly going to be highlighted. In a moment, we're going to start chapter 13. I'm going to show you a map of the tribes that they conquered, the places that went unconquered, and that's going to be important to get a good visual of what we're dealing with going forward. But in the meantime, the text at the end of chapter 12, the second half of chapter 12, actually writes out all of the 31 kings that the Jewish people destroyed under the leadership of Yehoshua in the land of Israel. There's 7 major nations, and then within those 7 major nations, there are minor city-states and tribes amongst them, comprising 31 total kings. And this is going to be interesting. I'm not going to read the whole thing, because as you could see, it's just a list in reality. So look at Pesukim 9 all the way to 24. It's really just a list of the different kings, and they go in order. I'll just read a few of them just so you get a sense. Melech Yericho, Ehad, the king of Jericho, 1. Melech Ha'ai, the king of the Ai, which was on the side of Bet El, Ehad, 1. Melech Yerushalayim, Ehad, the king of Jerusalem, 1. Melech Hebron, Ehad, the king of Hebron, 1. Melech Yarmut, Ehad, Melech Lachish, Ehad. Melech Eglon, Ehad, Melech Gezer, Ehad. Are you seeing a pattern here? 1, 1, 1. It's just basically listing each person, each king, its territory, and then it says the word 1. Melech Yerushalayim, Ehad. Melech Devir, Ehad. Melech Herma, Ehad. What is the text doing over here? What is actually going on here with all of these Ehad? How does this list supposed to look, right? It's a little bit strange. So for anybody who has looked into a Torah and ever read, well, I'll start with this. How many people have ever seen a Megillah? You've seen a Megillah, right? A written Megillah. So how are the sons of Haman written? What does it look like?
A list.
Right, a list, right? You have on one side the name, and then on the other side it says Ve'et, right? And then it goes like that. So that's how it looks with the Aseret B'nei Haman. Our rabbis tell us that that's exactly what this would look like if we were to write it on parchment. So we don't have a Megillah of the book of Yehoshua, but we have a rabbinic tradition how to write and break down all of the books of the Tanakh. The books of the Tanakh that we don't typically read in public, like a Megillat Esther, typically are not written on parchment. We don't have experience with that, but there is a rabbinic tradition how to go about doing that. And this paragraph, or I shouldn't say paragraph, this section of the second half of chapter 12, if it were to be written on a scroll, on a parchment, it would look exactly like the tribes, the sons of Haman. You would have the name of the king and his province on one side, and on the other side it would say Ehad, 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 which leads us to understand that this was almost like a song. It was almost like the way we're supposed to sing the 10 sons of Haman with ta'amim and in a certain way. There's a uniqueness to this list of the 31 kings of Canaan, and it's structured in a very specific way to give us a certain message. And I'm going to talk about what that message is in a minute when I read the Gemara in Masechet Megillah. On the flip side, has anybody ever seen how Shirat Hayam, the song of the sea that the Jewish people sang after Hashem split the sea, has anybody ever seen what that looks like in the Torah? Have you ever seen the structure of how that's written? No? So maybe I'll pull up a picture here. Just give me 1 minute. I probably should have done this before, right? I'm going to pull up an image. You could even Google it on your phone if you want, probably. And where is it? Here. So for those who are watching us on the Zoom, okay, this is what the Shirat Hayam will look like, okay? I can maybe pull it up here for a second. I'm going to type in, Shirat Hayam. I'm going to do an image here. Here you go. And I'm going to send this over here to, oops, sorry. Let's save that. Oops. Let me do it this way. Okay. Save to photos. I'm sorry, this is taking just 1 moment. I'm going to broadcast it out. Everybody can see. Yeah, the Az Yashir. Okay. So I sent that out also. You should have gotten it. Okay. So what do you see? What does that look like? I keep forgetting. I don't have it. I can give it. That's very bad. Yeah. Esther, maybe you could show Grandma Lori what it looks like, right? So what does that look like, Candice? What is it? Yeah. What the rabbis? Yeah, go ahead. The rabbis call it. So the rabbis over here call this half bricks on top of whole bricks. It looks like a building, right? It looks like a building. So here you have the words, and then on top of the words, there's an open space, and then words, and then an open space. This is what like a Jenga tower would look like, right? If you were trying to build a structure that would actually stand, this is what it would look like. You have a thing on the base, and then you pile on, and then you leave strategic empty spaces, and you're building something that could actually stand, right? So Shirat Hayam is built in a way where it looks like bricks on top of bricks in a way that would actually stand like a building, right? There's another song in the Torah that's written like that as well, in the Navi, I should say. We're going to hit it when we do the book of Judges, Shirat Devorah, the song of the prophetess Devorah after they destroyed one of the powerful armies that tried to attack them. We also have this Shirat David. David HaMelech also sings a song. So typically songs in the Torah are structured like this, with this brick-like type out, right? Versus the sons of Haman, which are in columns, and also the kings of the 31 Canaanite kings, which are also in columns. So what might the message be? What might the message be between bricks versus columns? Why is it that we have a rabbinic tradition to write these in a different way?
The columns will fall.
Right. Very good, right? Sturdy versus, I heard someone on the Zoom say, columns will fall. That's exactly what our rabbis tell us. So you already anticipated the Gemara, right? I'll read to you. The Gemara is up over here. It says, Amar Rabbi Hanina bar Papa, Rabbi Hanina son of Papa said, Darash Rabbi Shela. Rabbi Shela made the following dirasha, following deep idea. He said, Kol hashirot kulam, all of the songs in the Tanakh, nichtevot ariyah al gabe levana. They're all, a levena, I should say. They're all written as a half brick arranged atop a whole brick. Ulevena al gabe ariyah. And then a whole brick arranged on top of a half brick. The half brick is the empty spaces. The whole brick are the full spaces, the ones that are written in. And they're arranged in this way that they could stand. Chutz, with the exception of Shira Zo, this song, this is the Gemara in Masechet Megillah. So what might be they referring to when they say this song? What song are they talking about? Masechet Megillah, the sons of Haman, Megillat Esther. Except the sons of Haman, Umalche Kenaan, and the kings of Canaan, the Canaanite kings, the 31, as in our chapter. She'ariyah al gabe ariyah, they are brick on brick, half brick on half brick, ulevena al gabe levena, and brick on top of brick. Maita'ama, what's the reason? Shelo tehe tekuma lemapaltan, that there should not be a resurgence from their downfall. In other words, we're writing them and putting them in a way that they cannot rebuild themselves. They are going to collapse and fall and never rebuild and never come back up. So whereas the songs of the Tzaddikim, the songs of the Jewish people, talking about the greatness of God, talking about the power of the Jewish people and what they stand for, are written in a way that promotes sturdiness, strength, power, the wicked, such as the sons of Haman and the Canaanite kings who are destroyed because of their wickedness, they should remain as such. They should not be able to build. So in those days, eventually you couldn't build a tower too tall, because eventually if it got too high, it would collapse on itself. You had to build it wide, hence what it looked like, right? So that's why one looks one way and one looks the other way. So even in our rabbinic traditions of how things are written, there are already subliminal messages about what we want, about what we're trying to make a statement about over here. I thought that was just one interesting point to bring up, which might not always come through when you're reading it, on a computer via a screen. You might not always notice that, but the rabbinic tradition preserves the sturdiness of the Jewish people versus the wicked downfall of our evil enemies. There is, however, one other thing that's worth pointing out. In this structure, it lists those who the Jewish people destroyed, and it does it in a very subdued way. There isn't a lot of detail. There isn't a lot of gloating. There isn't a lot of promotion. It's just a very basic list. The king of Yerushalayim, 1. The king of Lachish, 1. The king of Yarmut, 1. The king of Eglon, 1. It almost reminds you of like almost a mourning ceremony to a certain degree, right? Like this is how you would memorialize them, like at the end of an award show when they do that in memoriam and they just kind of give one person after the other. It's not with any kind of excitement or happiness or jubilation of any kind, right? It's just a list and a very subdued one. And I think there's a powerful message in that while, yes, we conquered these kings and we took over their land, we did so, as we've talked about in the past, with a sense of recognition to human life, that while it was necessary and it was divinely ordained, it is not something that we do with happiness and joy and revelry, right? This was a message that was sent to Yehoshua very early on when the angel came to him and said, take off your feet because the land that you have that you're standing on is holy. The land of Eretz Yisrael is holy. It doesn't tolerate murder unless it's for the sake of God, but you have to be very careful about how you do it. And in his book, Rabbi Michael Hatton draws a very interesting one, which I would have never known had I not read his book. This is why sometimes academic books can be very, very intriguing, because he writes here a contrast, I should say, to what it looks like when other religions record their victories. Here, he writes as follows, and I'll read it to you. He says, it is instructive to compare the tone of our book with the roughly contemporary Ugaritic myth of Baal. This is one of the old idolatrous people, but which existed at the time of Yehoshua, unearthed at Ras Shamra in northern Syria in 1929. So this myth was excavated in 1929 in Syria and records an old ancient idolatrous myth. And listen to the language. He writes, in the following passage, Anat, the consort of Baal, so the Anat is the female version of Baal. Baal is a male version, which usually was a fertility god represented by a tree. It's one of the major idolatries that we will see come up later in the book of Kings, in the book of Melachim. Baal is a very powerful idolatry. As I said, it represents fertility, and it was very, very enticing to the Jewish people to follow it, because any god of fertility, how do you usually worship a god of fertility? I hate to say it this way. How did idolatrous people worship gods of fertility? That you're thinking about was the god of, not Baal, that is, that's Molech. Passing through fire is the god Molech. Defecating is Baal Peor. Is Baal Peor. That's the one, that's a different one. It's a different Baal. It's a different Baal. Baal Peor is a different one. But you can see that you have the texture, the connections over there. That's the one that the Moavim and the Midianim got the Jewish people to worship when they were together. But it has something also. What did they do with Baal Peor after they defecated? They also cohabited with women, right? So usually the way people worshipped fertility god, which was with corrupt sexual acts. That's how they did it, right? And so that's why you can ask people, why was idolatry so enticing? Well, it's enticing because of that, right? And so Anat was the female version of Baal, which also was a fertility kind of god, and they do battle against her foes. That's just a little background. Look at how the passage describes the battle for these gods. Anat went to battle in the valley. She fought between the two cities. She killed the people of the coast. She annihilated the men of the east. Heads rolled under her like balls. Hands flew over her like locusts. The warriors' hands like swarms of grasshoppers. She fastened the heads to her back. She tied the hands to her belt. She plunged knee-deep into the soldier's blood, up to her thighs in the warrior's gore. With a staff, she drove off her enemies. With the string of her bow, her opponents. She battled violently and looked. Anat fought and saw. Her soul swelled with laughter. Her heart was filled with joy. Anat's soul was exuberant as she plunged knee-deep into the soldier's blood. up to her thighs in the warrior's gore until she was satisfied. That is the kind of passage, it's difficult even to read, let alone hear. That's the kind of passage that you get in an idolatrous work talking about a god defeating its opponents and ending their enemies. It's bloodthirsty, it's gory, it's graphic, but it's also ha ha ha. It's also with revelry and with joy and gloating and in your face. And you contrast that with a list of 31 kings that are just mentioned by name with a 1 after it, almost to honor their memory to a certain extent. Basically saying, we did this because we had to, but we weren't happy about doing it. And we don't like to do it, but sometimes it's necessary. That's a very big difference. It's night and day when you compare our book and how it describes war to how other idolatrous books, and even in the modern day, describe what warfare was like and how they went about defeating their enemies. And that stark contrast, I think, is something important to highlight. Even in those times, it would still be applicable to us today to show the moral sense of what we are as a nation, that even when we do have to fight our enemies, we do not do so gladly. We do so with a somewhat heavy heart because we need to, and we need to remove evil from the world. And that's sometimes necessary, but not desired. And so that takes care of chapter 12, the two ideas of linking Yehoshua and Moshe together and the way in which the kings are recorded, as well as the solemn tone that the text puts into it. Any questions or comments or things to add over here about chapter 12? Go ahead, Candice. So that's where we're going to go in the next chapter. Yes, we're going to see that he's going to cast a lottery, lots, to determine who's going to get what. But it seems as though the plan may have changed slightly because they don't conquer the whole land. They leave parts of the land in the hands of the Canaanim. So now the lottery is going to draw out the land for the different tribes, and it may not have been what it should have been had they conquered everything. But yes, Yehoshua is going to get that. What? No, not really. But sometimes it was just practical. They couldn't get to everything, and Hashem is going to say that I'm going to eventually do it in the future. It won't be Yehoshua. It's going to be later. But the Jews will suffer for that fact until David HaMelech is eventually appointed king, who he rids Eretz Israel completely from all of the enemies. No. It will be interesting that Gaza, what is today modern day Gaza, is one of those areas which was not conquered by the Jewish people, was left in the hands of the Philistines. So speaking of which, let's move now to chapter 13, okay, as we go through here. So you could click on the next chapter if you're on the Mechon Mamre. We're on Yehoshua now, chapter 13. We start out now, we're talking about Yehoshua's breakup. And in the first handful of Pesukim here talk about the lands that they left in the hands of the Canaanim. So I'll just open the Pesukim and then you could take a look at the map I'll show you in a minute. V'Yehoshua zaken baba yamim. Yehoshua was old. He had come of days. That's usually the way they start, basically saying Yehoshua is on his way out. He's going to pass away. Now it's time to tie up his loose ends. Not everything's going to get accomplished in Yehoshua's lifetime. It's going to have to continue after his lifetime. Vayomer Adonai elav. God says to Yehoshua, Ata zakanta, you got old. Bate bayamim, you have come of days. V'ha'aretz nish'ara harbe me'od l'rishta. There is much left in the land for conquest, for inheritance. Zot ha'aretz ha'nish'aret. The following is a list of lands that are left around. Kol Gililot HaPilishtim v'chol HaGeshuri. All of the areas and cities and villages of the Pilishtim, the Philistines, and the Geshuri, the Geshurites. So I want to pause there for a minute. I'm going to, if you take a look, I sent it through in the chat, a map over here. Grandma Laura, since you get the live version, since I didn't give it to you. 1 second, let me pull it up here. Here it is. You can take a look at this one if you want. And I'm going to pull up the picture. Where is it? Here we go. For those on the screen with us. What just happened? Why did I go back to my credit cards? That wasn't good. I clicked on. It clicked on the wrong thing. Okay. No, so I'm going to show you how to look at this over here. Okay. I'm going to put this on the side here. Okay, let's zoom in. So you can see the key on the bottom of this. Yeah, you can see on the bottom it says the land that remains is in the lighter shade of gray. Okay, so you can see all that dark gray. All that dark gray is lands that the Jewish people conquered. You could see on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea where it says Philistines down on the left, and you'll see the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. These are very famous cities today, many of which they're right on the border of this is what we call the Gaza Strip today, right? Because you could see Gaza is there. So you could see there's the land of what was today having the Palestinians really ends right on the border where Ashkelon and Ashdod are. That's why those are the cities that keep getting pelted with rockets by the Palestinians, because they're right in the area of Gaza. That's where it is. This is the Gaza Strip. At that time, it was by a nation called the Philistines, not to be confused with the Palestinians. It sounds the same, but they're completely different people. The Philistines had that land, and this land remains in their possession despite Yehoshua's conquest of all the neighboring areas around it. The Philistines are going to be our arch enemy for the next few hundred years. Okay? They're going to remain here, and they're going to be a major, major thorn in the side of the Jewish people. Constant warfare, constant battle against the Philistines throughout the book of Judges, into the book of Shemuel, through almost to the book of Kings, right? Into the book of Kings. Shimshon is going to fight against them. Shaul is going to fight against them. David is going to fight against them. Constant battles back and forth between us and the Philistines. So that's one area that remains unconquered that we'll continue to read about time and again. If you go now up northeast, you'll see the Geshuri. You'll see another light shaded area. Okay, you see it says Geshur. That's the second major area of the Jewish people in the land of Israel that the Jewish people did not conquer. Right, and then if you go further up, you'll see the lands of the Emori and the Tzidonim. All those top areas. Damascus, that's Sham. Right, Aleppo is a little bit, I believe, north of that. I don't have it on the map, but it's there. Those are the lands of Syria, right? That's Syria. You can see that's where we descend from, right? Next to Eretz Israel. Okay, so those are lands that go unconquered. And then even within the gray area, you could see the triangular notes of the cities. Those are individual cities that still remained even within largely conquered Jewish areas. And so you can see there's a lot of these cities that are still there. Yivlam and Megiddo and Dor and Afek and Bet Shemesh and Akko. These are still some unconquered cities that are part of overwhelmingly conquered Jewish areas. And so by no means has Am Yisrael completely ridded themselves of the Canaanim. They're still very much around. They're still very much there. And as a result of this, there's going to be some struggle with settling the land and trying to set up a Jewish society without the influences of the Canaanim that are constantly infiltrating. So as we're going to read all throughout the end of the book of Yehoshua, and mostly in the book of Judges, the book of Shoftim, there's going to be a constant cycle of we do Avodah Zarah. Well, where is this Avodah Zarah coming from? If we conquered the land and we kicked everybody out, where's the Avodah Zarah coming from? Now you understand that it wasn't true. We didn't conquer everyone, and we didn't kick everyone out, and hence Avodah Zarah is still alive and kicking in the land of Eretz Israel. And so although it's overwhelmingly Jewish conquest and it's our territory, there's still people there that are living, and the influences are still there, and that's going to hurt us down the road. Any questions about that? Yeah. That's the $1 million question. Why? So why? Look, it's very difficult to conquer such a broad, wide piece of land in one fell swoop. It's a good question. It just seems as though every time they conquered, I mean, look, the people could have gotten tired. We don't want to fight anymore. We're exhausted. We've been fighting nonstop for 7 years. It's too much for us. We want to go back to our families. We want to settle down in our lands. Whatever we did, we did. We'll worry about this in generations to come. We'll do it a little more slowly. The Jews were still in Gilgal with the Mishkan. They were still operating out of a home base. Warfare gets taxing. It gets tiring. It's very challenging. With Hashem on your side, it could be a tremendous challenge. And so yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the question that still remains, but nevertheless, it's the reality of what we're looking at. It's the reality of what existed in that time. And it's hard to challenge them because 7 years of warfare is quite a bit of time. It's quite a lot. And now they're going to transition into a settling period before Hashem does promise that he's going to eventually take it out. You could see in chapter 13. So as we continue, Pesukim Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, all of those are the things that we just saw on the map. They're all the names of the places and the cities that we just pointed out on the map that I just showed you. I wanted to go down to the pasuk. I believe I'm trying to find the pasuk that Hashem says. Look at pasuk Vav over here. That she says, Kol Yoshevei Hahar, all of those living in the mountains, Min HaNevanon ad Misrefot Mayim. Kol Tzidonim, all of those in the Tzidonim, that northern area, that large northern area. Anochi Orishem, God promises, I will eventually conquer them. I will take them over. Mipnei Bnei Yisrael, with the help of the Jewish people. Rak hapileha liYisrael b'nahala ka'asher tziviticha. Right? Just make it into an inheritance for the Jewish people. So in other words, Moshe is going to divide up those lands which are not yet conquered even. Right? So he's going to divide it as if they conquered everything, but they have not yet conquered it. Right? So that's still going to be part of the game that's over here. Okay. In the next few Pisukim, we see that again, the Torah reiterates the breakdown for Reuven, Gad, and Menashe. So anytime Yehoshua is going to do something, the Torah always goes back to Moshe. You can see verses 7 and 8, right? Correct. Set it up exactly how it's going to do, and the process is going to be the same. A link. Exactly, 100%. And that's why it keeps going back to it, even though we've had it before, right? In Pasuk Zayin, he says, "Ve'ata halek et haaretz hazot b'nahala." Divide up this land as an inheritance, the Tish'at HaShevatim, to the 9 tribes, V'hatzi HaShevet HaMnashe, and the half of the tribe of Menashe that's left. Imo, with him, HaRubeni v'HaGadi lakhu halatam, the Reubenites and the Gadites, they took their land. Asher natan lahem Moshe, that Moshe gave to them, be'ever hayaden mizraha, in the land on the eastern side. Ka'asher natan lahem Moshe eved Adonai, as he gave them. And again, it recounts the lands that he gave to them, and the lands of Og, and the lands of Sichon, and which ones they took, and which ones they didn't take, almost to signify that just as Moshe had done it, Yehoshua had done it. But there's also a slight criticism here, perhaps, of Yehoshua, in the sense that what took Moshe very quick to do is taking Yehoshua and the Jewish people a much lengthier time period to be able to do. And they didn't do it with absolutism, right? They didn't do it in its entirety the way Moshe did it. So there are some missing ingredients over here to Yehoshua's conquest that were there in the times of Moshe's conquest. The rest of chapter 13 is in fact Moshe breaking up the land. Moshe, I said Moshe, right? Is Yehoshua breaking up the land. First, it goes through the rest of the chapter, Moshe's breakdown of the lands of Reuven, Gad, and Menashe, all the way to the bottom. And then it mentions one last thing at the very, very end of chapter 13. Uleshevet HaLevi lo natan Moshe nahala. To the tribe of Levi, Moshe gave no inheritance. Adonai Elohei Israel hu nahalatam. God, the Lord of Israel, is their inheritance. Ka'asher diber lahem. And that's again going to serve as a model for Yehoshua, who himself as well does not give any land to the tribe of Levi. He leaves them off as well. He gives them the cities, as the Torah said, individual cities for the Leviim to be. And those cities also double as Ir Miklat, as cities for incidental murderers to run there and flee there for protection. But they don't receive an inheritance per se within the land of Eretz Yisrael. Instead, Levi is out, and Yosef divides into 2 tribes, Menashe and Ephraim, and that constitutes the rounding out of the 12 tribes. So Yosef is divided into 2, and Levi does not get a tribe at all, does not get a portion at all. Any questions on that? Okay. with the time remaining, maybe we'll have another 5-10 minutes. I want to venture into chapter 14. Okay, so you can see we're kind of swimming along. That's not to say that we're not reading every pasuk. That's not to say that every pasuk is not important. I encourage everybody to, gloss through them. But a lot of it is details that you've seen on the maps, and sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So we don't necessarily have to read each verse. What we eventually get through the picture. And a lot of this is going to be details about the boundaries and the borders and who got what and where did they get it and so on and so forth. I don't want to call it Has v'Shalom boring details, but perhaps it's not the main crux of what we want to bring out from the text. And so I'd like to venture here now into chapter 14, where we could talk about one other theme that pops up before or as Yehoshua is now going to divide the land amongst the Jewish people. So we started on 12, we got into 13, we're now into 14, and we're going to talk about one last idea to round out today's class. If we start reading in chapter 14, it now talks about Yehoshua's breakdown. So whereas the end of 13 talked about Moshe's breakdown, now chapter 14 talks about Yehoshua's breakdown. That structure is still there. Moshe, Yehoshua, Moshe, Yehoshua. Ve'ele asher nahalu b'nei Yisrael be'eretz Kena'an. These are the lands that the Jewish people inherited in the land of Canaan. Asher nahalu otam Elazar HaKohen v'Yehoshua bin Nun, that were distributed and given as inheritance by Elazar HaKohen. Elazar is the son of Aharon HaKohen. He was the second Kohen Gadol. And Yehoshua bin Nun, student of Moshe. So you could see the synergy between Moshe Aharon to Yehoshua and Elazar. Moshe is Yehoshua's teacher, Aharon Elazar's father. So this is, again, that link in the chain to the next one. How are they going to divide it? Verse 2, Begoral nahalatam. They're going to divide it based on a lottery that is going to be obviously divine in nature. Ka'asher tziva Adonai biyad Moshe, as God commanded in the hands of Moshe, letish'at hamatot v'chatzi hamateh, to the 9.5 tribes. Ki natan Moshe nahalat shnei hamatot v'chatzi hamateh me'eved hayadin, because Moshe already gave 2.5 tribes their land on the other side of the Jordan River. Verse 4 tells us that the sons of Yosef constitute 2 tribes, Menashe and Ephraim, and no land was given to the Leviim except for individual cities for them to reside, for their animals, for their families, and for their cities. Just as Moshe had commanded, verse 5, Ken asu b'nei Israel, such is what the Jewish people had done. And now we get an interesting story. So before Moshe is ready to divide the land, he's going to draw the lotteries, he's going to divide the people, everything's going to be divinely inspired. There is a small, I don't want to call it a protest, but there is a ha'ara, a mention of something that takes us back to the Torah. One individual approaches Yehoshua and says, Yehoshua, remember that I was promised a very specific piece of land in Eretz Israel. So before you go around picking lotteries and dividing up the land, I would like the portion that I was promised. Who is that individual? Anybody know? Take a look if you want to cheat. It was Yehoshua's partner when he was in the sin of the spies. Kalev ben Yefuneh, right? We have not heard of Kalev ben Yefuneh for quite some time. The last we've heard of him was indeed in the story of the sin of the spies. The 10 spies are killed. The 2 spies, Yehoshua and Kalev, are the only ones who continue on. Yehoshua obviously takes over the leadership position, and we don't hear much about Kalev. But Kalev, nevertheless, lives on, and all of a sudden he reemerges here on the scene, asking for his portion that he was promised because he was not a member of the sin of the spies. Let's take a look at that story briefly. Verse 6. Vayigeshu b'nei Yehuda el Yehoshua. The members of the tribe of Yehuda approach Yehoshua, vayomer elav, and they say to him, Kalev ben Yefuneh ish Kenizi. Kalev ben Yefuneh, the member of the Kenizi, says to Yehoshua, Ata yadata, you know Yehoshua, et hadavar asher diber Adonai el Moshe isha Elohim, the matter that God spoke to Moshe, the man of God, al odotai ve'al odotecha, on what happened to you and what happened to me. We have a kingship between each other. We were the 2 spies that survived, the Kadesh Barnea. Ben arba'im shana anochi. I was 40 years old. Bishloach Moshe Eved Adonai oti mi Kadesh Barnea. When we were sent to the land of Israel to spy on the land. Leragel et haaretz. Va'ashev oto davar ka'asher im levavi. and I brought back the message of my heart to Moshe Rabbeinu, the correct message. Ve'ahai asher alu immi, but my brothers who went with me, himsiv et lev ha'am, they melted the hearts of the people. Ve'anochi mileti, but I was complete with God, behind the Lord my God. Vayishava Moshe promised on that day, Im lo ha'aretz asher darcha raglecha bah, the land which Caleb trudged on, lecha tiyeh nahala, it shall be for you, ulbanecha ad olam, and to your children for all eternity. Ki mileta achare Adonai Elohai, because you were complete with the Lord your God. And so he says now, ve'ata, behold, hine hecheya Adonai oti ka'asher diber. God has given me life until this point, ze 45 shana, 45 years. So how old is Caleb now? He's 85. Why is this important? Caleb is 40 when the sin of the spies happens. He's now 85. 45 years have passed. How many years did the Jewish people wander in the desert from the time he was the sin of the spies till they entered the land? Not 40, close. 38, because they were already in the desert for 2 years prior to that. Those 2 years counted in the 40 years total. So he was 40 years old when they sent the spies. The punishment comes down, they wander an additional 38 years in addition to the 2 they had already been there. So now Caleb was how old when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel? 78. Now he is 85 and they're ready to divide the land. This is how the rabbis know how long did it take them to conquer the land? 7 years. It never says it in the text, but using the timeline of Caleb's life, the rabbis are able to put together that it took them 7 years to get to this point where they've finished conquest and they're about to divide the land up, one to the other. And I'm going to come back to that point. Why is it significant that the timeline is attached to Caleb? Why specifically the timeline is attached to Caleb is a beautiful point. So Caleb comes and he approaches Yehoshua and he continues this long language. You could read the Pesukim on your own, 10, 11, 12. Eventually Yehoshua blesses him. Vayvarechehu Yehoshua. Yehoshua blesses him. Vayiten et Hebron leKalev ben Yefuneh nenahala. He gives to Caleb the city of Hebron, the very important, very historically significant city of Hebron. This is a city we battle for today, a city we visit and we yearn to hold on to and to continue to have possession of and perhaps even expand our reaches in this day. Unfortunately, there's a lot of strife in Hebron, but nevertheless, there are brave Jews who are living there now. We visited them on our trip about a few months ago. And it's really an amazing thing to go to Me'arat HaMachpelah, which really makes Hebron so special. It's the city of our forefathers. That's where Abraham buried Sarah. That's where all the forefathers are. That's where they lived many years of their life. It's the land of our ancestors, perhaps more than Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is certainly the capital. It's the center. It's where the Beit HaMikdash will be. But if you're looking at the lands of our Avot, the lands of our forefathers, more than Yerushalayim, Hebron is the land of our forefathers. It's where they lived. It's where they're buried. It's where many of their tests and difficulties came to life. And therefore, Hebron is such a significant city. And who should take control of it? None other than Caleb ben Yefuneh, who was steadfast and true with God during a time when faith was challenged amongst the Jewish people. If you go back to the Torah, it never actually says that Caleb went to Hebron. It says that the spies collectively went to the land of Israel, and then cryptically the Torah says, Vayavo ad Hebron, and he came to Hebron. It doesn't say who the he is, but it just says in the singular. And our rabbis connect the dots. They say there's a singular unidentified person who goes to Hebron during the sin of the spies. And here in chapter 14, that one person, Caleb ben Yefuneh, is promised that land and receives the land of Hebron. So put 2 and 2 together, the rabbis understood who was that mysterious person who went to Hebron from the sin of the spies. It was Caleb ben Yefuneh. Why did he go? Why did he go to Hebron? Candice, you have to know this one. But he went there because he wanted the land? Yeah. Okay, good. Good. There's one other detail that the Midrash adds in why Caleb went to Hebron specifically. Why did he want to see the patriarchs? What did he do there? He did one very important act, what probably we all do when we go. What do we do when we go? Pray. The Midrash says. He went there to pray that the forefathers should give him strength to not fall prey to the sin of the spies. Kalev connects to the faithfulness of the avot, of the forefathers, and he draws strength from them to be able to overcome the challenge of not falling into the plot of the spies. How did he draw that strength? Because what the forefathers were so great at doing, what makes them the pillars of our religion, is that they were able to trust in Hashem and have faith in God at the bleakest of times, when everything looked like it was going in the opposite direction of what they had been promised from God. They drew their faith and they trusted that no matter what, Hashem is going to provide. Avraham Avinu was promised a legacy. He's promised that his children will inherit him and they will continue his legacy and they will inherit the land. And yet he's commanded to take his only son up to the Mount, to Har Moriah, and sacrifice him there. The two butt heads. They don't go together. God, you promised me a legacy. Now you're telling me to kill the only son that I have left after you told me to throw out my other son, Ishmael. Any normal person would question God at that point. These two don't go together. It doesn't fit. Faith. Trust in Hashem, no matter what. Total and complete abolishment of the self, and say, if this is what Hashem wants, it's what it is. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I know I need to listen to Hashem. Yitzchak and Rivka, barren. We're going to have a legacy. Can't have children. Yaakov and Rahel, same thing. Each of the forefathers is promised certain things, and then they watch their life unfold in the exact opposite way than what the promises tell them are going to happen. Yaakov is told, you're going to get this land. Then what does he need to do? Go to Egypt. How does this fit God? Each of them had tremendous ta'anot. They had great claims against God. They're steadfast in their faith. The Jewish people had that moment at the sin of the spies. God promised us the land of Israel. He told us it's a land flowing with milk and honey. He told us it's a great land. But then the spies come back and they say, no. It's bad. The giants are there. We can't do it. The Jews are now up against this struggle. God's promise versus what their eyes and how way things are unfolding. How are they going to win? The Jewish people falter. But who doesn't? Kalev. Why? Because he went to the graves of his forefathers and he drew that faithfulness, that strength of how to overcome when your eyes see something different than what God has told you. You have to trust and you have to have faith. And the Jews stumbled at that moment. Now, when they're about to split up the land, the dream has come true. They've conquered the land. They have it at their fingertips. The text reminds us, don't forget about Kalev. Don't forget about the guy who had the faith all along from the very beginning. When everything looked like it was down, he trusted. And he gets Hebron, the land of the forefathers, because he belongs to that category of faithfulness, of trustworthiness, of steadfastness with God when everything seems to have. And this is a tremendous message for us, because especially going into Rosh Hashanah, all the time we look around and we say, what happened? We're the chosen people. I'm supposed to have this. I'm also had promise. I do mitzvot. Doesn't the Torah promise me this? And sometimes life doesn't unfold exactly as we think it should, or exactly as we predicted, or exactly as it would seem to have been promised from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's at those times that we dig deep. We muster up our inner Kalev ben Yefuneh, who mustered up his inner Avot, and we have to say at that point, we trust in Hashem. Things will unfold as Hashem wants. If we do what Hashem has asked, and we follow in Hashem's Torah and in His commandments, there's nothing else that won't get taken care of on its own. Everything will fall exactly into place as it was meant to be. And so beginning that journey of settling the land of Eretz Yisrael, which is going to be so challenging and so difficult to avoid the Avodah Zarah and to live connected with Hashem, it starts with giving Kalev ben Yefuneh his portion that was granted to him through faith in Hashem. So that takes care for today. We did chapters 12, 13, and 14. Nice and smooth going through. We talked about a lot of different themes in Conquest. We talked about the kings. We talked about faithfulness. We talked about Kalev. I hope you enjoyed this class. Be'ezat Hashem, we're going to continue in the next few chapters. The next handful of chapters are, again, more details about the boundaries and borders of Eretz Yisrael. So I'm going to try to figure out where we're going to go from here as far as the most important chapters vis-a-vis lessons, so we may skip around a little bit towards going to the end of the book, but we're now in the second half of the book of Yehoshua, talking about the settlement of the land. We started it today. Be'ezrat Hashem, we will continue in next week's class. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful day.